Boston, Fall 2006. The old Bennett house sat quiet beneath a canopy of rust-colored leaves, its stone facade softened by time and ivy. Richard Bennett stood at the top of the staircase, staring at the door he hadn't opened in 18 years. It was late afternoon, the kind of chill October air that seeped into your coat sleeves and made the wood floors groan under your feet. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older, dust, perhaps, or memory. He hesitated, fingers brushing the doorknob, then turned it with a slow breath and stepped inside. Grace's room was just as they had left it. The curtains, faded but drawn, let in narrow slivers of light that streaked across the walls like frozen shadows. A stuffed rabbit with a fraying ear perched on the neatly made bed, and next to it, a pale green blanket folded into a perfect square. Her books were still lined up on the shelf by the window, picture books mostly and early readers with peeling stickers on their spines. A tiny ceramic lamp shaped like a carousel horse sat on the nightstand, gathering dust and silence. On the dresser was a silver-framed photo. Margaret had taken it the summer before everything changed. In it, Grace wore a wide smile and a straw hat too big for her head. Around her neck was the pendant, delicate, oval with a small emerald set into its center. Richard felt his breath catch as he stared at it. He had given her that pendant for her 8th birthday, just a week before she vanished. The photograph had once been comforting. Now it was a wound. The room felt suspended in time, preserved like a museum display. And perhaps that's what it was. A monument to innocence and everything he had failed to protect. Richard stepped closer to the dresser, his hand brushing the edge of the frame, then turned toward the closet but couldn't bring himself to open it. Some things had stayed shut too long. Margaret would have known what to do. She had always been the one who saw clearly through the fog of grief and crisis. She had been practical, warm, and strong, the kind of woman who held the seams of a household together without drawing attention to the stitching. When Grace was born, Margaret had lost too much blood. By the time Richard made it back from the hospital cafeteria, she was gone. One heartbeat in, another out. After Margaret's death, Richard had poured himself into his work. Designs, contracts, deadlines, anything to keep his mind from splintering under the weight of loss. He built buildings, estates, gardens, entire environments of calm and order, hoping it would reflect back into his own life. It didn't. Then came Julia. A decade younger, elegant, composed. She had brought warmth back to the house in those early years, laughter even. But it was always a little staged, a little too rehearsed. Richard appreciated her presence, her steadiness, but it wasn't love in the same way. It was more like balance. Now even that balance felt tentative. Today was Julia's birthday. Richard had agreed to take her into the city, something she always looked forward to. Shopping on Newbury Street, an indulgent lunch, a stop at her favorite chocolate shop. He owed her that much. He closed Grace's door gently, the latch clicking softly into place. As he descended the staircase, he caught a glimpse of Julia by the front door, adjusting her gloves in the mirror. She looked beautiful as always, hair swept back, pearls resting just so on her collar. She offered him a bright, practiced smile as he reached the foyer. "Ready?" she asked, and he nodded without a word. The ride into Boston was quiet. Julia chatted about a neighbor's kitchen renovation, the upcoming gala at the museum, the usual. Richard let her voice fill the silence, answering where needed, but his thoughts were elsewhere, lost somewhere between Grace's picture and the ghost of her laughter. They wandered into boutiques, tried on scarves, sampled perfume. Julia flitted between displays like a dancer, light on her feet, commenting on fabrics, colors, the way a coat fell on her shoulders. Richard followed her movements but didn't absorb them. Then they stepped into a small jewelry boutique near the corner of Dartmouth and Newbury, tucked away like a secret. It was the kind of place where the air smelled of velvet boxes and old money. Julia moved toward the back display. Richard stayed near the entrance. And that's when he saw her. Not Julia, someone else. A young woman behind the counter, helping a customer with a delicate pair of earrings. Her hair was tied back, her posture upright, voice soft but confident. Around her neck was a pendant. Richard's chest tightened instantly. The pendant was silver, oval, and in its center sat a tiny emerald. The chain was thin, barely visible in the light, but the shape, the setting, was exact. Identical. It wasn't similar. It wasn't close. It was the same. He stood frozen, the sounds of the boutique muffled under the thud of his own pulse. He hadn't seen that necklace since the day Grace disappeared. He had given it to her. No one else should have it. And yet here it was, worn by a stranger. Richard didn't move. He simply stared, the floor beneath him suddenly unfamiliar, the world no longer predictable. Everything safe had shifted. He didn't know how yet, but the feeling was clear. Something was about to change. Richard didn't remember how long he stood there, staring at the pendant. Long enough for the young woman behind the counter to finish assisting her customer and turn toward him. Her expression was polite, pleasant, expectant, completely devoid of recognition. She greeted him with the easy charm of someone trained to make strangers feel comfortable, and though her voice was calm and professional, it sent a jolt through him. Not because it was familiar but because it wasn't. He had braced for something, a flicker of shared memory, a look of startled recognition, but there was nothing. Just courtesy. She introduced herself as Lena. No last name. No hesitation. Richard nodded stiffly, pretending to browse, though his eyes kept flicking to the pendant hanging just above the neckline of her blouse. It swayed slightly as she moved, catching the light the same way it had in that long-ago photo. He asked about it, casually at first, a comment on its beauty. Lena touched it absently, as if it were nothing more than a habit, and said it had been a gift from her adoptive mother. One of the only keepsakes from childhood, she added, almost as an afterthought. Richard asked nothing more. He couldn't trust himself to speak without his voice shaking. The moment they left the store, Julia chattered about a pair of earrings and whether they were too bold for the gala. Richard mumbled something agreeable, but his mind was already spiraling. He couldn't stop thinking about the necklace, about Lena. Adopted. A gift from her mother. No memory before a certain age. Too many coincidences stacking into something heavier than chance. That night, long after Julia had gone to bed, Richard sat alone in his study. He didn't drink much anymore, but the glass of scotch in his hand felt necessary. He turned the photograph of Grace around in his fingers. The pendant gleamed from her small chest, unmistakable. It wasn't a common design. He had it made, custom, commissioned from a jeweler in Prague during one of his early architectural trips. He still remembered the craftsman's cluttered shop, the cracked leather portfolio, the old man's precise hands. Only one pendant had ever been made. Just one. He pulled out a dusty old address book from the bottom drawer, flipped through the pages and found the name he hadn't thought of in years, Victor Shaw. Victor had been a former police detective, now a private investigator with a reputation for persistence and discretion. Richard had hired him once before in the early years of Grace's disappearance, back when hope still had sharp edges. It hadn't led anywhere, but Shaw had been thorough, respectful, and unafraid of hard truths. Richard picked up the phone and dialed the number. Victor answered on the third ring. His voice was rougher than Richard remembered, older but alert. Richard explained what he had seen, carefully, methodically, knowing how it might sound. He didn't ask Victor to believe him. He only asked him to look into the girl. The next morning, Richard sat across from Julia at breakfast, barely touching his coffee. She was scrolling through her phone, talking about remodeling the guest bathroom, when he finally mentioned the girl at the store. Not Lena. Just the pendant. The resemblance. How strange it was. Julia looked up, her smile faltering slightly. "I thought we agreed," she said quietly, folding her napkin with deliberate precision. "You weren't going to keep doing this to yourself." Richard didn't respond. She set the napkin down, gave him a long look and added, "You need to let the past stay buried, Richard. It's not healthy." He nodded, said nothing. But her choice of words didn't sit right. Stay buried. Not let go. Not move on. It felt rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for this conversation. That night, when she came to bed, she lingered at the door a moment too long, as though deciding whether to enter. Richard pretended to sleep. 3 days passed before Victor called back. His voice was low and steady, the way it always had been. "I found something," he said. "You were right to call." Lena had been found in 1996, alone, wandering along a rural road near a small coastal town in Maine. A pastor had spotted her outside his church just after sunset. She had no ID, no memory of where she came from, not even a last name. The authorities had assumed neglect or abandonment. She was placed into emergency foster care, and later adopted by a couple from the next county over. She had been estimated at around 8 years old. Victor paused, letting the words settle. No reports matched her back then. But the timeline, the location, it's close, Richard. Damn close. Richard didn't speak. He just stared out the window of his study, watching the bare branches of the trees sway against the gray October sky. Something cold and inevitable settled into his bones. He had started this to satisfy a doubt, to chase a thread that might lead nowhere. But now the thread was tightening, pulling him toward a truth he might not be ready for. And somewhere in Boston, a young woman named Lena was wearing a pendant that should never have existed anywhere else in the world. The day after Victor's call, Richard moved through the house like a ghost. Every room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had shifted slightly overnight. Julia noticed his silence but said nothing. She'd grown used to his quiet spells over the years and had long since stopped asking where his mind went. That morning she left for a brunch with friends, and the moment the door closed behind her, Richard stood in the center of the bedroom they shared, suddenly and inexplicably alert. He didn't know what he was looking for. Only that something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that hummed beneath the surface like a draft through a closed window. He walked to her dresser, the one she always kept meticulously arranged. The top drawer held scarves, hand cream, loose buttons. The second, her jewelry. But it was the bottom drawer, stiff on its tracks, that caught his attention. Beneath a folded cashmere shawl lay a small, padded box. And under that, a plain white envelope, sealed, aged, and slightly curled at the edges. His breath caught. There was no name, only an old postmark. June 1996. The sender was a rural facility in Maine, a mental health clinic he had never heard of. His hands trembled as he turned it over. The seal was unbroken. He held it for a long moment before sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket and closing the drawer as if nothing had been disturbed. Later, in his study, he opened the envelope slowly, with the kind of care one uses for something ancient and fragile. Inside was a single page, a summary from the clinic, addressed to a Mrs. Julia Bennett, confirming intake details for a patient, Grace B., brought in by a non-relative guardian, later discharged into state care. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He sat frozen, the paper limp in his hand, his mind dragging him backward through time. To Julia's calm voice all those years ago, gently urging him to rest, to let the authorities handle things. To her quiet dismissal of new search efforts, always wrapped in concern for his mental well-being. To how she had offered to coordinate the memorial service, to pack up Grace's things, to help him let go. He saw it now clearly, how Grace had never quite fit into Julia's world. The way Julia's smile had tightened whenever Grace mentioned Margaret. The small corrections, the avoidance of bedtime routines, the way Julia never used the word daughter. The first years after Margaret's death had left Richard hollow, adrift, barely able to parent. Julia had stepped in, efficient, nurturing in a way that looked perfect from a distance, but there had always been a coldness under the surface. He hadn't wanted to see it then. He needed her, needed the stability she brought. But now the pieces were falling together and the pattern was grotesque. Victor called again that afternoon. He had found more. After being discovered behind the church, Lena, then listed as Grace B., had been placed into emergency state care, diagnosed with dissociative memory loss. No one knew where she came from. No fingerprints, no school records. Just the pendant and the name she kept repeating in confusion, Maggie. A foster couple took her in after 3 weeks. They renamed her Lena. Victor's voice was unusually hesitant as he relayed the details, knowing how close to home they struck. That evening, Julia returned home to find Richard standing in the bedroom doorway, the envelope in one hand. Her expression faltered for the briefest second, then smoothed into practiced calm. "What's that?" she asked lightly, toeing off her heels. Richard didn't answer. He stepped aside and let the silence speak for him. Julia's eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to his face. Her smile wavered. "You're digging up things that don't matter anymore, Richard? You're hurting yourself." He said nothing. She moved closer, her voice softening. "You haven't been well lately. Ever since you saw that girl. I think it's making you imagine things. It's understandable, really. You never got closure." It was subtle, her tone. Gentle concern laced with doubt. The same tone she had used when she persuaded him not to restart the search years ago. Gaslighting wrapped in empathy. But this time he didn't budge. "I know what you did," he said finally, his voice low. Julia stood very still, then let out a breath and turned away. She walked to the window, opened the curtain slightly, and stared out at the dark yard. "I didn't hurt her," she said after a long pause, her voice barely audible. I helped remove the pain." Richard didn't move. The words sat between them like a confession scribbled in fog. He didn't know yet how far it had gone. But he knew this much. Julia had played a part in erasing Grace from their lives. And the truth, whatever it was no longer buried. It was rising. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. No return address, no note. Just her name, Lena, typed neatly on the front and a single first-class stamp pressed into the corner. It stood out from the usual stack of bank statements and catalogs, sitting like a question on the edge of her kitchen counter. Lena turned it over in her hands, hesitating before peeling the flap open. Inside was a photo, aged, slightly curled at the edges, the colors faded into a warm, grainy hue. It showed a little girl standing in a sunlit backyard, no more than 7 or 8 years old. Her dress was white with blue trim, her hair gathered in a loose braid. She was smiling, one hand reaching toward a wooden swing suspended from a broad oak tree. Behind her stood a house, large, colonial in style, with wide-paneled siding and green shutters. She didn't recognize the place, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. The girl in the photo was her. Lena sat down hard at the kitchen table, the photo trembling in her hands. She had no memory of this scene. No recollection of the swing or the yard or the house. But she remembered the necklace. It hung around the girl's neck, glinting in the sun. The same pendant she wore now, the same one she had never taken off since childhood. That evening she drove to her adoptive parents' house without calling first. And Matthews opened the door with a smile that faltered when she saw Lena's expression. They sat in the living room without turning on the TV, the air between them dense with unspoken words. Lena placed the photo on the coffee table and slid it forward, and stared at it for a long moment before lifting it with trembling hands. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It came in the mail," Lena said quietly. "No note. Just this." And nodded slowly, pressing the photo to her chest. Then she leaned back into the couch, her eyes glassy. "You were wearing that pendant when we found you," she said. "Wandering near a church outside of Belfast, no coat, no shoes, just that necklace and a dazed look. You didn't know your name. You didn't even speak for the first week. You kept saying Maggie in your sleep over and over again. That's all we ever had to go on." Lena didn't know what to say. It was the first time she had heard her mother speak with such clarity about that day. "We thought we were doing the right thing," and added, "The system didn't know what to do with you. We filed to adopt after 3 months. We gave you the name Lena because you needed one." The next day, Lena requested a DNA test. She didn't know what she expected, maybe more confusion, more questions. But when the results came back, they confirmed it beyond any doubt. Grace Margaret Bennett. Daughter of Richard and Margaret Bennett. She was Grace. Richard received the call from Victor that same afternoon. He didn't ask for details. He just closed his eyes, exhaled, and sat in silence for a long while. When he opened his eyes again, something in him had changed. Victor had found the final missing piece. The money trail. Years ago, Julia had made payments to a now disgraced attorney named David Hale. At the time, Hale had been a specialist in estate shielding and asset management, particularly for clients who needed certain complications to disappear. Victor had traced the wire transfers and located archived correspondence between Julia and Hale, coded but unmistakable. Julia had paid Hale to arrange Grace's removal. Discreet placement. No questions asked. The truth was no longer speculation. It was fact. That evening Richard visited Julia one last time. She was staying at a friend's estate on the Cape, having quietly slipped away from Boston after Richard's silent withdrawal. When he arrived, she was sitting on the veranda, wrapped in a cream shawl, sipping white wine like nothing had ever happened. She didn't pretend to be surprised to see him. Richard stood across from her and placed a manila folder on the table. Inside were the copies, bank statements, emails, the clinic envelope. Her face didn't change. Not at first. "I did what I thought I had to," she said finally. "You were unraveling. The grief was consuming you. I couldn't reach you through it." "You hired a man to erase my daughter," Richard replied, his voice even. "I gave you a chance to heal," she said. "I gave us a life. A future. She was Margaret's daughter, Richard. You never looked at her without seeing your first wife. I couldn't compete with that." He stared at her, his face unreadable. Julia looked away. "It was done for love," she said, quieter this time. "Even if you can't see it." Richard turned without a word. As he walked down the gravel path toward his car, he felt no victory, no satisfaction. Just the weight of years lost, and the faintest glimmer of something unfamiliar. A beginning. Not a clean one, but a beginning nonetheless. The early morning fog lingered low over the Cape as Victor Shaw pulled his car into the gravel lot of the retirement facility. The building was plain, almost forgettable, with faded clapboard siding and windows that looked out over wind-bent trees. Inside, everything smelled faintly of antiseptic and soft oatmeal. At the front desk, a nurse led Victor down a quiet corridor to a small room at the end of the hall. David Hale sat near the window, wrapped in a worn cardigan, his eyes dull and glassy as he stared out at the gray sky. Age had taken much from him, his sharpness, his posture, his reputation, but the weight of his past clung to him like smoke. Victor introduced himself, not expecting recognition. Hale barely blinked. It wasn't until Victor mentioned the name Julia Bennett that something shifted. Hale's fingers twitched and he turned his head just slightly. It was a memory not in full. It was instinct. Victor placed the folder on the table between them, along with a small leather notebook that had been recovered from Hale's storage unit. It was mostly filled with incoherent scribbles and grocery lists written years too late, but one page stood out, neatly written, dated July 1996. Subject: GB transfer complete. Guardian arranged under pseudonym. Final location: Pine Hollow. Victor had to look it up. Pine Hollow was not a town, but a private religious retreat on the outskirts of mid-coastal Maine. Long since defunct, its records had been sealed after allegations of abuse and neglect in the early 2000s. The pieces locked into place. Julia had fabricated her own emotional breakdown, brief, convincing, dramatic enough to gain Hale's sympathy. She had spun a story about a widower spiraling into madness, a child too traumatized to cope, and a need to protect Richard's legacy from being destroyed by his grief. Hale, ever the fixer, had agreed to help. The girl had been quietly removed, transported to Pine Hollow, and eventually lost to the system under a new name and identity. By the time Richard arrived at what remained of Pine Hollow with Grace by his side, the wind had picked up along the coast. The old chapel stood crumbling at the edge of a gravel path, its steeple leaning, its bell long silent. Inside, pews were coated with dust, the stained glass faded and cracked. A single nun remained, a woman in her 70s who still lived nearby and occasionally checked in on the abandoned grounds. When Richard asked if she remembered a little girl brought in the summer of '96, she squinted, then nodded slowly. She never spoke, the nun said. But she wore a little green stone around her neck. Clutched it in her sleep. Wouldn't let anyone take it off her. Grace stood quietly beside her father, one hand resting on her chest. The pendant hung beneath her sweater, but she could feel its shape, its weight, the way it always seemed to anchor her in moments she couldn't explain. Back outside, the wind whipped along the cliffs and she turned slowly, looking toward the trees lining the edge of the property. A swing, she said suddenly. There had been a swing. Just behind the kitchen building. A wooden seat, frayed rope. Richard followed her gaze. There was no swing now, only a rotting beam and a stump where a post had once stood. But the image in her mind was clear. Later they sat in a small diner a few miles down the road. Grace stirred her coffee, her brow furrowed as she chased something elusive in her thoughts. She spoke in fragments. A woman in white. A smell like lavender and bleach. A lullaby, just a few notes, something Margaret used to hum. It wasn't much. But it was something. Back in Boston, the legal process moved quietly. Julia was arrested with no headlines, no handcuffs in public. The authorities cited conspiracy, obstruction, fraud. Richard didn't attend the arraignment. There was nothing left to say. He focused instead on the slow work of rebuilding. Grace moved into a small apartment on the first floor of the Bennett brownstone. She kept her job at the jewelry store but took fewer hours. Some days she spoke freely, laughing at Richard's dry humor or asking about Margaret with a growing hunger. Other days she was quiet, distant, retreating into silence without warning. Richard learned to follow her pace. To offer but not push. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the last of the golden leaves scatter across the yard, Grace looked over at him. The porch light flickered behind her, casting a soft halo across her hair. "I keep thinking about how close we were," she said. "How many times I must have passed you in this city and never known." Richard nodded, his hands folded in his lap. "You never stopped looking?" she asked. "Not once," he said. There was a long pause. Then she reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "Thank you, Dad," she said. The word hung in the air, tender and weighted. Richard turned to her, eyes stinging, and gave her hand the faintest squeeze. They sat like that for a long while, beneath a sky that was darkening slowly, honestly as all things must, no longer haunted by the past but shaped by it, gently, like sea glass washed ashore. It wasn't a perfect ending. But it was theirs. And it was enough.